In what way has the United States' attempt to ally with Sunni Arabs produced trouble for the American people? The answer to this question is part of a much larger uh, set of questions. Namely, how has the United States' attempt to ally with any number of potentates around the world produced bad results for the American people? The answer to that question lies in the United States' attempt to outsource, as it were, the making and execution of foreign policy, rather than to assert one's own interests directly. In the Middle East specifically, the alliance with Sunni Arabs follows the failed attempt to make an alliance with the Shah of Iran the centerpiece of American policy in the Middle East. In 1953, the U.S. government essentially supplanted the British government's primordial role in the Middle East when it played a major part in placing the Shah of Iran in a position of power inside his own country. And then in the following 2 decades, proceeded to make the Shah of Iran into the most powerful figure in the Middle East. Iran is a Persian and Shia power, and it took care of American interests in the region really rather well. The U.S. government, however, foolishly and ignorantly undermined the Shah by abetting his so-called white revolution, which secularized the country and made him an enemy of the Shia clergy and of devout elements within the Iranian population. That led to the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, which brought to power the Islamic Republic, which was fiercely anti-American and, of course, aggressively Shia and Persian. Now, this Islamic Republic committed an act of war against the United States and seized the U.S. Embassy. Rather than answering this act of war with something alike to it and showing the world that the United States would not tolerate that sort of thing, the U.S. government sought to find another counterweight, another paladin for itself in the region among the Sunni powers. Now, of course, that's almost a contradiction, because in the area, the Sunni states, which are more populous than than Iran's Shia state, simply were not powerful. In fact, the Saudi monarchy and the Gulf monarchies were congenitally weak. These are places where work, high and low, is done by foreigners, and those who work are held in contempt. Armed forces, although expensively equipped, are fit only for internal repression, are quite inefficient. They cannot exert internal power, never mind international power, never mind be paladins of the United States, especially since their populations are inured to Islam's 2 most exportable plagues, the Wahhabi sect and the Muslim Brotherhood. At any rate, these monarchies were quite useless. That is the reason why, fully knowing this, why the U.S. government aggressively courted Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein ruled Sunni, ruled mostly Shia Iraq with an iron hand, a bloody iron hand, and the U.S. government thought that it could wean him away from his near alliance with the Soviet Union. It spent most of the 1980s trying to wean him away and thought that it had done a good job. In 90, however, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and set himself up to be Lord of the Gulf. At that time, the U.S. government realized that it had made a bad bet and found itself with really no Sunni power that could or would play the role that the Shah had played for the U.S. government in the past. Nevertheless, the U.S. government sought to continue in its fruitless quest, and that led to slowly but surely to our current troubles. The second question is what should have been done rather in 1990 and later in 2003 by the U.S. government rather than what in fact was done, namely to try to defeat Iraq, but not thoroughly, to defeat him only to the specifications of the Saudi and Gulf monarchies. These monarchies, being Sunni, very much wanted Saddam's Sunni rule in Iraq to continue. They didn't want, however, Iraq to be so strong as to overawe them. They wanted the U.S. government to hold Saddam down, but not too much. They wanted the U.S. government to do Saddam a little harm. Now, that is exactly what the classics of international relations say one should never do. Never, ever do your enemy a little harm. The classics say either remove him from the possibility of doing any harm or caress him. We had been caressing Saddam Hussein, went to war with him. He had not been the direct enemy of the United States. Went to war with him, did a little harm to him, and ended up with him as a blood enemy of the United States, in fact, a leader of anti-Americanism in the Muslim world between 1991 and 2003. So much so that the U.S. government was felt compelled to invade and take him out. But no more in 2003 than in 1990-91 was the U.S. government ready to face the consequences of defeating Saddam Hussein. Those consequences, those inevitable consequences, were the breakup of Saddam's Iraqi empire. That empire was made up of roughly 65% Shia Arabs, roughly 20% Kurds who wanted nothing to do with any Arabs whatsoever, and about 17% Sunni Arabs who had been lording it over the rest under Saddam. Now, the U.S. government, both in 1990 and in 2003, had the option of overthrowing Saddam and coming into the area as champion of its own interests, but protecting the Shia Arabs who had been victimized by Saddam, thereby earning their gratitude. That gratitude was earned simply by overthrowing Saddam. They were well disposed toward the United States. And of course, by letting the Kurds fulfill their wishes and to build Kurdistan. The U.S. government did the exact opposite and entered Iraq as the champion of Sunni interests, of the interests of the smallest of the major groups, and the groups that was hated by the other two. And a group which, by the way, was unreconciled to the United States and disposed to hate it because the United States had broken up their neat little empire. This was a terribly foolish thing to do. It was not in the United States' interest, except in the shortest of terms. In 2003, as in 1990, the Gulf monarchies and Saudi Arabia argued to the United States that going into Iraq as protector of Sunni interests. Holding the country together was the easiest thing to do, the one that required the least effort. They couldn't have been more wrong. It turned out to be the hardest, bloodiest, and least thankless thing that the United States government could possibly have done. This alliance with Sunni interests, brokered by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies, turned out to cost the United States over 4,000 dead and some 30,000 maimed for life. Possibly worse than that, it cost the United States prestige and respect that we have yet to regain, and we may never be able to regain. At least we have not started to regain it. That is a terribly, terribly serious problem. President Obama has talked about making Iran, to make the main Shia power, a responsible member of the international security architecture. Is this a good idea? This is a foolishly contrived concept. Iran is, whether anybody likes it or not, a major player in the area. It is a major power in the area. It has its own interests and pursues them above all others. It is not part of anybody's security architecture. It is a contender. It's absolutely necessary, indeed essential, for the United States, for anybody who is involved in the region, to take into account Iran's and everybody else's interests, and to realize that they will act only in that interest. That does not necessarily mean that Iran is our irreconcilable enemy in every possible way. What should our policy be toward Iran right now? There is no way that we could possibly undo the problems that we caused for ourselves and for so many others by not answering Iran's provocations of 1990 and of subsequent years appropriately. That legacy of weakness will hang around our necks, and we may or may not be able to get rid of it by wise actions in dealing with the problems of the day. The problem of the day is not of today. It may very well be tomorrow's problem. The problem of today is not Iran. The problem of today is caused by ISIS, which is an outgrowth of Wahhabi Sunni Islam. And that is a problem because not only has ISIS killed Americans, ISIS is fostering the killing of Americans by Americans among us. Now, to destroy ISIS, it is imperative, in fact, it is inescapable, that Iran, which is its main local enemy, because of its Shia nature, will be involved. It will be involved, it is involved, whether we like it or not. Whether we call it being part of a security architecture or not, Iran is involved in the fight against ISIS for its own reasons, in its own ways. It behooves us to take that reality into account. The same goes, by the way, for Russia. Again, this does not mean that we are in any kind of alliance, but it would be foolish not to recognize parallelisms of interests when in fact they occur, be these parallelisms ever so short. The question is, how do we as Americans deal with the problem of ISIS? The first thing to realize is that ISIS, despite the fact that it is also a problem for the Muslim world, and irrespective of that fact, that ISIS is a problem for us. As I've mentioned, it is a problem for us because it has killed Americans, and it is a growing problem for us because it fosters Americans killing other Americans in the name of ISIS, in the name of the Wahhabi version of Orthodox Sunni Islam. Having recognized that it is at war with us, the only reasonable alternative, the only rational alternative, is to make war on it. War in the dictionary sense of the word, war in the historical sense of the word. That means killing as many of the people as possible. The statement has sometimes been made, we can't kill our way out of this problem. That attempt has not been made. We most certainly have not tried that. And I hate to say it, but it's so obvious that it is, but it is very difficult for dead men to cause problems. And it is entirely possible, and not all that terribly difficult, for us to kill them all. And I am not talking about going house to house looking for them. That would be the most foolish thing in the world to do. We have plenty of technological power with which to do it. Artillery, massive air bombardment, not the kind of pinpricks that we have been practicing. Does this involve the killing of civilians? Absolutely. It involves the killing of such civilians as choose or cannot help but be around them. By the way, up until recently, there's been no reason for civilians to move away from ISIS because they had paid no price for being close to it. The moment that we begin targeting ISIS seriously, there will be a very, very serious movement of civilians away from them, and civilian casualty will decrease. But that is not the point for us. The point is to destroy those people because they are the threat to us. We can do it, and shame on us if we don't do it. We will pay the consequences for not doing it. The last question is the most interesting of all, namely, how is the debate about these matters, which is now going on within the Republican Party, first, most immediately, and in a larger sense among the American people in the course of the 2016 election, likely to affect America's future. Note, first of all, that this is the first time in 100 years that the American people have confronted the basic problems of U.S. foreign policy, namely the basic purpose of foreign policy, the basic orientation of foreign policy. Note well that between the time of George Washington and that of Theodore Roosevelt, including Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt himself, that is to say, the men on Mount Rushmore, there was a consensus among the American elites and among the American population that the purpose of foreign policy was to defend, protect America's unique nature. We were exceptional not because of what we did in the world, because of what we were. And again, the idea of foreign policy was to keep people who are not like ourselves culturally, although we certainly had a broad enough definition of culture to include not just Europeans, but also Japanese and Chinese who came to America under not so good circumstances, but nevertheless assimilated really very quickly and quite thoroughly. At any rate, the point was that America was unique, and the purpose of foreign policy was to maintain that uniqueness. Now, this completely excluded the notion of trying to transform the rest of the world or being like the rest of the world. That changed in the progressive era. Progressives in both the Democratic and the Republican Party decided that we were not so different from other nations. In fact, that other nations really wanted the same things that Americans wanted, and that we were simply ahead of them in the great evolutionary story, and that the job of America was to lead the rest of the world along the evolutionary path in economics, in mores, in politics. The U.S. government pursued the goal of changing the world for about 100 years, and through any number of wars, all of which, every one of which, left the American people quite dissatisfied. You must realize that the gulf between, the gap between the American people and their leaders with regard to foreign policy has done nothing but widen during the past 100 years. In the most recent period, this gap has grown so wide as to be unbridgeable. The American people, it appears, have finally said, stop, we don't trust any of you to carry out our relations with the rest of the world. Full stop, we've got to rethink this. That is what this debate that is going on now, mostly in Republican, but also among the American people in general, is all about. Intellectual honesty always being all too rare, we can not be sure or even terribly confident that the American people will be faced with the right alternatives espoused by the right candidates, or that the right candidates will in fact follow through with their promises. Nevertheless, it is important to note that the right questions are being asked, and that at least some of the answers clarify the problems before the American people, and we may hope that the American people, well informed, will choose wisely. Thank you for your attention.